You'd make a big mistake if you think I hadn't heard of colonialism. But also, don't think, if I may say so, that colonialism was just a Western thing. What was one of the largest and most significant empires in history but the Ottoman Empire? Do we say that Turkey has to do something like the West to deal with
That's
this?
not the issue.
I've seen it firsthand.
Look at Turkey, 3.5 million refugees. Look at Lebanon and Jordan per capita.
What I'm suggesting to you is...
In fact, in Lebanon, you've got...
Let me just finish this point.
That's a valid issue, but let me respond to it.
Let me finish the point.
States of the region, it's a valid issue. But unlike the European countries, allow me to just make... Because the resources are not being poured into this. Let's face it, the policies are not there. The resources aren't there.
I have to say, you're going to bark up the wrong tree if you think you're going to persuade a Brit that we should stop drinking alcohol because of people arriving in our country. I mean, that's not going to happen. These things are all a bit of give and take.
That you bring your own traditions that don't quite fit with theirs.
So please don't try to make this a kind of bigoted European mistake.
Which of your
That would be a
values
very dishonest way to... That would be a very dishonest way to represent
Just answer this question
debate.
directly if you can. Which of your values are you most afraid to lose? Which ones are most threatened?
In this Doha debate, it all started calm. But stay tuned, because it quickly turned into one of Douglas Murray's most intense exchanges on TV. At first, the host steps in confidently, clearly thinking she can corner him with moral pressure. But watch what happens next, because that confidence didn't last long. You can literally see the shift the moment he begins responding. And from there, things take a sharp turn.
Douglas Murray, thank you very much. A few provocative thoughts, no doubt, that you mentioned there. A few jumped at me, such as when you said the developing world cannot move to the developed world. You seem to conveniently forget that the developed world moved to the developing world without asking permission. It seems to me as well that this is a particularly Western-centric viewpoint, and a misleading one at that, because you know as well as I do, and the figures show it, 85% of the world's refugees, in fact, settle in neighboring countries in the Middle East, in Africa and Asia. They do not rush over to Europe.
Sure. You'd make a big mistake if you think I hadn't heard of colonialism.
You don't seem to address it in any way.
I'd also suggest, by the way, that I don't know how long we're going to go on about colonialism for. I'm happy to do it as long as you like. But let me just...
have to be factful, though.
Douglas begins by speaking about migration pressures in Western countries, but right away, the host cuts him off with colonialism, almost like she's trying to redirect the entire conversation. Douglas stays calm and asks how long the past will be used to dodge today's issues, and you can feel the tension building instantly.
Well, don't we have to be
But also, don't think, if I may say so, that colonialism was just a Western thing. What was one of the largest and most significant empires in history but the Ottoman Empire? Do we say that Turkey has to do something like the West to deal with this?
That's not the issue.
You brought up colonialism.
You're not asking people with other traditions whether they care about the sight of people drinking alcohol or going up in bikinis. Again, it's a very
we could in Britain
Western-centric viewpoint.
Douglas straight up wasn't having any of it.
I'm not. I have to say, you're going to bark up the wrong tree if you think you're going to persuade a Brit that we should stop drinking alcohol because of people arriving in our country. I mean, that's not going to happen. These things are all a bit of give and take.
You bring your own traditions that don't quite fit with theirs.
Well,
they don't.
Yeah, there are, as I said, and before we got all confrontational, which you did from the get-go, I said what the problem is here is that these things are all rubbing against each other. And in that situation, you have to work out what things you're willing to give up, which things you're willing to compromise on, and which ones you're not. You're not going to persuade the Brits to massively change their culture.
Then she tries to claim colonialism was only a Western issue, but pauses here, because this is where Douglas brings up the Ottoman Empire. And the moment he does, her reaction says everything, as you can see the argument slipping.
We call brown people migrants. We call white people who go abroad to work expats. This is really important.
Migrants versus expats, there's a very clear reason. It's expected, rightly or wrongly, that expats don't stay in the country and bring up their families and stay for generations. The assumption with migrants currently has been in recent generations, that they are going to stay and that it's going to be a multi-generational thing. That's the assumption. You brought up colonialism.
You are talking about the Western view that they should stay where they belong.
I'm saying that it seems to me to be much wiser that if you have a very large humanitarian crisis in, for instance, Syria, you try to make sure that people remain in the area. This isn't say all of them.
A few minutes later, out of nowhere, she shifts to alcohol and clothing norms, implying Britain should adjust its traditions to avoid offending newcomers. But watch Douglas here. He responds instantly, saying no Brit is giving up alcohol just because someone else disapproves.
I absolutely agree they do.
do.
I've
I mean,
seen
look
it
at
firsthand.
Turkey,
What I'm suggesting,
3.5 million refugees. Look at Lebanon and Jordan per capita.
What
the
I'm
countries that have
suggesting
the
to you
most. In
is-
fact, in Lebanon, you've got 1 in every 4 person living in that country is
Absolutely.
a Syrian refugee.
Absolutely.
So to suggest they're not doing very much is just being misleading, being dishonest.
Believe me, I'm not being misleading. And I said from the outset that I agree with the point that most refugees remain in the area. And I said that I think that that's a good idea. I'm suggesting to you that I think it's better that people, for instance, fleeing Syria, end up in the countries around Syria in order to be able to return to their country than putting them in
but
Norway.
they will return. You are suggesting that they don't want to return. Who, in their right
I'm not
mind, if
suggesting
they
they
had
don't
the
want to return.
option,
When did I
and
say
we will
that?
hear from a refugee, if they had the option to return, of course they'd want to return.
I didn't say they wouldn't. It wouldn't just be the Italians. Now, the Italians, by the way, and let me just finish this
That's
point.
a valid issue, but let me respond to it, because you mentioned the states of the region. It's a valid issue, but unlike the European countries, allow me to just make this point, unlike the European countries,
I'll respond to 2 points.
They are not parties to the 1951 Refugee Convention. So the legal obligations are, well, it's just a fact.
From there, she gets more impatient, interrupting faster and pushing harder. Meanwhile, Douglas stays steady and explains that places like Italy are overwhelmed, not cruel. A point she keeps twisting, even as his tone stays controlled.
Conveniently, isn't it?
But I'll let you carry on.
But this means that countries that are signatories to the refugee conventions get more blame and more assumption that they are going to have to hold more of the burden than countries that didn't. And I'm suggesting to you that nobody should be able to absolve themselves from blame. But if you go to Italy now, and I don't know when you were last there, but it is not the case that this is going well in Italy, either for the migrants who are arriving or for the Italian population.
Isn't it because the resources are not being poured into this? Let's face it, the policies are not there, the resources aren't there.
I see these people when they arrive, I follow their stories. It is not the case just that they don't, you know, the local populations in Italy I've been to Lampedusa, I've seen the boats coming in. The local populations are extremely generous. They are extremely kind to the people. Most of the populations in Europe, let's just not have this idea that Europeans are somehow incredibly cold-hearted. Countries in Europe have taken in a lot of people, and they are trying to deal with a very big problem very swiftly.
Then comes another shift. She starts painting the West as morally inferior, but Douglas dismantles each claim one by one. And at this point, the contrast becomes impossible to ignore. But guess what?
Because much of your argument, Douglas, seems to be about the us versus them, the fact that, you know, we have our own values, our own Britishness, our own virtues, and they will come to our shores with their values, their traditions. You seem to almost suggest that they come to your countries with a lesser breed of values.
No, I don't think I said that at any point, and that's another time you've tried to put something in my mouth.
So when you talk about the difference in values, what do you suggest?
Look, first of all, I didn't say that. I said that there are challenges because we do know that there are challenges, and let's just be frank about this. I mean, for instance, I've been in the Gulf for the last week or so. I see more burqas in my home city of London than I have seen in the Gulf in recent days, certainly here in Doha. Now, I can't say I'm delighted by the sight of more and more burqas in London. Do I feel any hatred of the people who wear them? Of course not. Of course not.
When she accuses him of viewing migrants' values as lesser, Douglas stops her immediately. He mentions seeing more burqas in London than in Doha, not as an attack, but as an observation about cultural change, and the room just goes silent.
And definitely there are times I think, you know, what percentage of burqas in this area becomes like not that pleasant for everyone else?
But again, is it all down to burqas? Because again, you're not asking people with other traditions whether they care about the sight of people drinking alcohol or showing up in bikinis. Again, it's a very
we could in Britain
Western-centric viewpoint.
I'm not. I have to say, you're going to bark up the wrong tree if you think you're going to persuade a Brit that we should stop drinking alcohol because of people arriving in our country. I mean, that's not going to happen. These things are all a bit of give and take.
You bring your own traditions that don't quite fit with theirs.
Well,
they don't.
Yeah, there are, as I said, and before we got all confrontational, which you did from the get-go, I said what the problem is here is that these things are all rubbing against each other. And in that situation, you have to work out what things you're willing to give up, which things you're willing to compromise on, and which ones you're not. You're not going to persuade the Brits to massively change their culture, but let me just make the point. Every single society has certain aspects of it doesn't want to give up.
She tries circling back to alcohol again, almost like she's hoping to recover the argument. But Douglas refuses to budge. Britain isn't abandoning its traditions just to avoid offending newcomers.
Let me just make the point. Every single society has certain aspects of it doesn't want to give up. This one will. In Qatar, this one will. Everyone does. So please don't try to make this a kind of bigoted European thing.
Which of your
That would be a
values are
very,
you most
very
afraid
dishonest
to
way to.
lose?
That would be a very dishonest way to
Just
represent
answer this
this
question
debate.
directly if you can. Which of your values are you most afraid to lose? Which ones are most threatened by
freedom
the
of
arrival
speech.
of refugees?
Freedom of speech. It's the first one.
Then he explains why free speech is a core Western value, something many Islamic majority countries restrict. And once again, she has no real response.
That's not a problem?
I mean...
You think that's not a problem?
But
you think, sorry, no, let me pick up on that. Let me pick up on that. It's
What about the
very
values of
easy to
tolerance,
snigger.
values
It's very easy to snigger about this until you've had friends shot in a newspaper office. It's very easy to laugh about that until it's happened to people you know.
And finally, his last point lands instantly, wiping away the last bit of confidence she was holding on to. You can actually see the frustration take over. Stay tuned for the next video. Don't forget to subscribe, and I'll see you next time.